Hello and welcome to the Deviants Tour Chicago edition. I am so excited to be here today with author and historian Eric Marcus and some wonderful co-hosts. But before I get to official introductions, I did want to take a moment to acknowledge the pain that our nation is feeling amidst the loss of Black lives at the hands of our nation's law enforcement. To any Black folks who may be watching, your lives matter. To my predominantly white fans, we must do better. I have posted a link in the Crowdcast description above for those who are looking to make a difference for our friends who identify as QTPOC. In the meantime, please join me in a moment of silence to honor the lives of Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others. Thank you. And now I'm excited to pass the speaking stick to Jen Dentel, who can talk a little bit about her wonderful organization and their great resources.
Thanks, Eric. I'm Jen Dentel, and I work and volunteer at Gerber Heart, which is a LGBTQ library and archives in the Rogers Park neighborhood in Chicago. So we focus on the LGBTQ history of Chicago and the Midwest. We do a lot of exhibits. Our current exhibit is Lavender Women and Killer Dykes, which is about lesbians and feminism in Chicago in the 70s and 80s. So please give us a follow on Instagram at Gerber Heart and on Facebook, and we'll continue doing virtual events as well throughout the next few months.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and if you click the little eye above next to the title, you can see their logo, and also just click that to see some great resources that they offer. I don't know about you, but it says Vivian has disappeared. Let's see if we can get her back. If not, let's see. It says she's coming back. Maybe we'll just do self-introductions then. Is that okay, Eric?
Yes, of course.
Sure. Well, my name's Eric Cerveny. I'm the author of The DEVIANT'S, the Homosexual versus the United States of America, which just came out this past Tuesday. So I'm so excited to talk about one of the few people in the world who has gotten to sit down and actually talk to Frank. I never had that privilege. It's one of my great regrets. So I'm so excited to talk with you, Eric.
Delighted to talk with you. And I'll keep the self-introduction very, very brief. I'm Eric Marcus. I am the host and founder of the Making Gay History podcast, author of a book called Making Gay History. I'm a journalist by training, and I couldn't be more excited to be here to talk to you, Eric, and ask you questions about this book that I'm riveted by and humbled by, because your research has been fierce. It's really astounding. It's astounding.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. But I'd love to, I know you have questions for me, so I apologize in advance for turning any of them on you, but I'd love to kind of hear about your interactions with Frank. And because you were kind enough to share the transcript with him. And I'd love to hear about your own experiences, where it was, how did you get to know him?
Well, and I apologize for being, I'm a bit in the dark. I'm not in my house because it's a long story, because of internet issues, and I didn't want to lose you midway. But the lighting is a little bit, I may have to move around once the sun goes down and I wind up in the dark. So Frank was a name that came up over and over again when I was doing my research, and I knew I had to interview him. So I had not met him before I went to meet him at his house. And I was warned that he was odd. And I think now, and I wonder if you think this, Eric, if I knew anything about, well, we didn't know anything about the spectrum in those years, but he really felt like somebody, I look back now, someone who's on the spectrum, which served him brilliantly in his work, very single-minded, spoke the truth, couldn't deal with people who couldn't be rational. And of course, the reasons that gay people were thrown out of their jobs was completely irrational. So Frank took me into his house, right into his office, which was a mess. It was file cabinets, files, piles of dust.
And what year was this?
1989.
Okay.
So it's 31 years ago.
Yeah.
So the lawn was scruffy. He was in the northeast neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Lawn was scruffy. Frank was a little scruffy. He had if he didn't have a pocket protector, I can't remember now. He was the kind of guy who had a pocket protector with pens. Clearly a scientist, a brilliant man. So I sat opposite him across his desk, and it was as if he was addressing an audience of hundreds. He spoke at me, and the spit was flying, and there was no way to. It was very hard to corral him and to actually direct the conversation, and so I just had to let him go. He had so much to share, and that was possibly the only time I interviewed him and met him. I spoke with him after that by phone. So my impression of him was that he was a force of nature, and what the times called for was a force of nature. And the government had no idea what they were getting themselves into when they fired Frank Kameny in 1957.
To put it mildly.
Yes, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting, especially for me as someone who didn't have the honor of getting to meet him, and also writing a book that was really isolated to just his activism in the late 50s through the very early 70s. And the sense I got is, yes, he had that very forceful personality. If anyone, I would recommend anyone listening to listen to your interview with him, but also watch a video with him to also hear his voice, because he had a very distinctive, not the most pleasant voice to listen to. I've heard it compared to a foghorn, very nasally. Jack Nichols described it as staccato. And so I'm hesitant to diagnose him as anything, whether it's on the spectrum or as a hoarder, but I will certainly say there were these eccentricities that I do think compounded on themselves over time, which was actually,
I asked my own therapist to help me understand Frank.
Really?
And he said that Frank, it sounded like Frank was just so I could understand this guy, because everyone talked about him being odd and quirky. Yeah. And he actually reminds me in terms of his focus on Greta, please forgive me, what is her last name? The young woman who is the climate activist.
Thunberg.
Yes. In that she talks about how her autism has served her in her activism.
Really?
And I think that Frank it was very similar in that way. He was so certain of his convictions. And there were other people in the movement at the time who also felt they were right and the rest of the world was wrong. I had in reading your book and reading all Frank's words and his court cases that he wrote himself, he was so forceful in his beliefs at a time when he had no reason to believe what he believed, because the rest of the world was saying that he was wrong. Right. So my therapist hates labels, and he always says you shouldn't label people. So I pull back on saying Frank was somewhere on the spectrum, but my experience of him was similar to my experiences with other people who have different emotional capacity and live in the world in a different way. And the way Frank's brain worked allowed him to see the world with such clarity.
Yes.
Now, I'm curious what it was like to spend as much time as you did. It was years in the mind of, and the papers and writings of Frank Kameny. I just got to sit with him for 2.5 hours. You lived this for years. And what prompted you to spend a chunk of your life? How many years did you spend with Frank?
7 years. 7 years.
You're 27.
28.
28. So you spent a quarter of your life with Frank. What was that like?
I would compare him to a computer program. that that had emotions. He did, but for him, it was a matter of logic, right? Something was either just like a binary.
Yes.
It was either logical or illogical. And anything did not fit in the bucket of logic. Good luck. Good luck getting past him. Whether you were a human or an institution. And so very much from the very beginning, you know, he discovered he wanted to be an astronomer, studying astrophysics at the age of 6. And for him, that came very, very naturally. And then to understand other people's illogic, to understand discrimination as a function of, irrational prejudice was something that came very easy to him. What was much harder was not conceptualizing it, but framing it or packaging it in a way that was palatable to other people, because it came very naturally what was illogical to him, because as you said, he didn't care about social norms or the way things were done. It was either logical or illogical. And so, you know, he was really a force of nature against anything that was illogical. And over time, I do think he became more adept, especially in his hearings, like in the Pentagon, after his congressional hearing in '63, realizing how to actually engage. And there's even letters from his own mother saying, Frank, you know, I heard you on the radio, you need to tone it down a little bit. And he does become better and understands kind of the media savviness of activism and how important that is, and learns from people like Randy Wicker, and learns from people like Lily Vincent or Nancy Tucker in Washington. And what was so interesting also is the interview that I relied upon the most, that really the very first chapter is about his early years, and the interview I relied on the most was Kayla Huson. She was, you know, I will always be indebted to her, because she was writing her own book, The Gay Crusaders, and she recorded a 10 or 11 hour interview with Frank in 1971.
Where is that?
That's in the New York Public Library.
It is. It is.
And it is because, I mean, as you know, Frank and Barbara Giddings and Kayla Huson, they were friends, and Frank did not have many friends. So it's very hard to get him in this completely unfiltered, very comfortable setting. And I was just so blessed to have found that recording and spend hours upon hours transcribing it and really diving in deep, because you get some of that unfiltered, just more informal interactions, and you realize he's hysterical. He's a very funny guy, even though the people who detested his political strategy, he cracked them up, because he was a character, didn't watch TV, listened to operas, timed the amount of time that it would take to get from one stoplight to another, and so had some of those eccentricities, as I call them.
So what attracted you to him in the first place, and how did you wind up getting hooked enough to spend a quarter of your life with this one person who was so unique and so important and not recognized as such for years? So what was it that pulled you in?
I will never forget the moment because the very first time I heard his name was for a urban history seminar, when it was before I think I was officially even majoring in history, and one of the requirements is you had to work in an archive, and I had never been in an archive before. So my very first archival experience was at the Library of Congress in the manuscripts room, opening up Frank's papers, in this realization that this wasn't just a copy, right? This wasn't just, a photocopy or a digitized document. I was holding the dress code for the very first gay picket outside of the White House in 1965.
1965.
That as a student, as a 20-year-old, I had no idea that it was possible for me to physically touch. They don't even require you wear gloves except for the photographs. You can physically touch these documents that are history. And I think it's something that I wish was more built into our high school curricula, of understanding that real history, the real study of history, is more like the movie National Treasure than it is like what they teach in high school. It's literally digging up and excavating the past and finding knowledge that no one else in the world knows, or at least remembers. And it was that realization that, as you saw it in its raw form all throughout his house, hundreds of thousands of pages. And God bless them, the archivists at the Library of Congress, who actually went through and organized it and made it chronological. It made it relatively much easier for me to realize, okay, not only does he deserve his own book, because until this book, there was a chapter on him. You had him throughout yours because you recognized how important it was. But he deserves not just one book; he deserves like a Robert Caro-esque.
Well, but you did that with your book, because it's not just, for people who haven't read it, it's not just Frank Kameny. You put him in the context of the times and provide such a window into a world. This is stuff that I was immersed in at a very superficial level, because I cover 50 years of the movement through about 100. I did 100 interviews, but only 60 some odd in the book. But you go in deep, and I had no idea. I knew it was bad, but I had no idea how bad it was. And you bring it to life in a way that most journalists and historians can't do after 30 or 40 years of writing. So there are people who've been doing this work for decades who hate you.
No comment.
I'm going to switch around to where there's more light. Just give me a second here.
Well, I will say there are several, especially, of course, historians. I mean, you can't, but we have to thank people like John D'Amelio and George Chauncey and Margot Candidate, all these incredible people who laid the framework for academic.
All of us stand on the shoulders of people like that. But some of that stuff is unreadable. And what you've written is so readable. It's almost a page turner. I don't want to call it a page turner because that would make people think it wasn't serious work. But it documents a piece of history, a period of history that set the. It was the ground. Let me think of the word I'm looking for. It was the miserable environment that the government created, that our society created, out of which Frank Kameny grew this movement. He wouldn't have happened if not for the oppressive era in which he lived. And the stuff that people did, when you sent out your book, you sent it out with a questionnaire. And I thought it was a joke. Can you tell people what that questionnaire is and what it is?
Yes. So for friends and colleagues who I sent advanced copies of the book to, I persuaded my publisher to allow me to send it with a letter. We had to be very careful because the legal department, they actually made us change the eagle on the front of the book because it was modeled after the Hoey report, the 1950 Senate document that legitimized the gay purges for the next 25 years. But I wanted to lean into that as much as possible of this was really how persecution functions on a bureaucratic day-to-day level. And one of the letters that the Defense Department sent out, that was actually the letter you received. For people who didn't receive the letter, it said, "Dear Mr. Marcus, it has come to our attention that you have engaged in homosexual activity in the recent past. Please answer the below questions. Have you engaged in anal or oral sodomy in the past 5 years? How many times? How many people? And how many locations?" I think was the last one. And that was an actual letter that was sent. It was sent to Otto Ulrich, the Library of Congress employee and Mattachine member, who lost his security clearance because the Pentagon found out that he had engaged in homosexual activity. And his was really the first case that because of Frank's and Barbara's efforts, the government did not want them coming into the Pentagon to interrogate their own witnesses and to, you know, spend hours upon hours proving how really government policy was just a product of prejudice. And so what they did is they said, we're not going to do a hearing. Instead, we're just going to send you these interrogatories, this letter for you just to fill it out, and then we'll decide whether or not you get to have your clearance. But it was really a blessing in disguise, because then Frank and Barbara were able to say, oh, well, previously you didn't allow reporters into your hearings, your interrogations, where you were asking these obscene questions. Now we have the physical document that we can just make photocopies of and send it to the Washington Post and to Senator Ervin, who was leading the anti-privacy invasion crusade of the 60s. And so I liked it as a way to kind of slap people in the face and say, look at how persecution worked.
Unbelievable. I mean, who are they to ask you? And such, like, who are these prurient people who are asking about specific sex acts? It's like, it's none of their business.
Yeah.
But they did.
Mm-hmm.
They did. And if they hadn't created that hostile world, Frank would never have come into being as Frank Kameny, as this crusader, who really transformed the nascent homophile movement and turned it into an activist movement that eventually, after '69, became a national gay rights movement, then a national gay and lesbian rights movement, then an LGB, and then an LGBT, and where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
But without Frank, we wouldn't be here. Now, you made a decision to focus on a specific period of time, and I'm curious how you came to do that and why you chose that period.
Yes, the original intention, my senior thesis, which is locked away in the basement under Widener Library in Harvard, because I don't want anyone to read it, was I wanted to write the history of the Mattachine Society of Washington. That is what I wanted to write. But then over time, you know, as I got my master's and my dissertation, really you realize that at times, not always, but at times, the Mattachine Society of Washington, which is the group Frank founded, for anyone listening, was synonymous and solely synonymous with Frank Kameny. And especially in the later years, especially after Stonewall, it really was just him. He kept renewing the registration in the District of Columbia through the 80s, but it ended up being a one-man organization. And
didn't he say early on, Eric, that he said it was I modeled the organization after me. It was my organization, and it would do what I wanted it to do. Am I remembering that correctly? Or something like that?
He said that he regretted not making it he always regretted making it a democratic organization. That was his largest regret. I think he did, and he would deny, at least in the 60s, maybe later on, he may have admitted that it really was, but like his interview with Barbara Giddings, or with Kayla Huson, he would say, they said, was it really just modeled after your own personal fight? And you realize, and that's actually what my dissertation argued, is because most historians, you know, understand the importance of Frank within the homophile movement. But my argument is his real significance was within the legal civil liberties movement of, you know, specifically the ACLU, in creating gay rights as a valid civil liberties issue. That just was not a concept. It was literally written down in an ACLU document that gay rights were not a concern of the ACLU, because, you know, why would it? And so
he made it a concern.
Exactly. It's so, one of my biggest realizations was that the ACLU in Washington, their chapter, was it was scheduled for the exact same day of the very first meeting in November 1961 of the Mattachine Society of Washington. But because Frank Kameny and Jack Nichols wanted to go to that meeting in order to persuade the attorneys at the ACLU to take on the cause of the homosexual, they postponed that first meeting of the Mattachine Society of Washington until the next week. And so, you see this dual effort. And one of my arguments that I make in my dissertation is that the real reason that Frank Kameny allowed the Mattachine Society of Washington to die, that he would never admit, but the real reason it died was because at last the ACLU, the National Capital Area Civil Liberties Union in Washington, fully embraced all of the causes, the reason for existence of the Mattachine Society of Washington and its legal purposes. And so what does he do in 1969? Rather than rejuvenating his own organization, he runs for the executive board of the ACLU because at last his cause is a valid civil liberties issue.
So you decided to end your book in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
How did you choose that year?
His campaign, and the very last chapter is titled The Candidate. And he, for people who don't know, he was the first openly gay man to run for the US Congress in 1971. This is, almost a decade before Harvey Milk and his campaign. And really, that campaign is what then gave birth to the Gay Activist Alliance in Washington, D.C., which was the real successor, even though they tried to keep Frank out of the picture because of his totalitarian tendencies.
Yes.
That was really the successor to... So to actually answer your question, that's why I ended it in 71, because at the end of the day, this is the story of the Mattachine Society of Washington, which often was synonymous with Frank, but not always. And so when the Mattachine as a functioning membership organization died after his campaign in 71, I think February 71 was the very last membership meeting. So that's why I ended the book there. And I hope it's not going to be me. I hope someone will write. And that's why, I put all the papers and everything that I found online. I hope people will write the sequel because it's going to take another 10 years.
I've often been asked, "Well, you're going to write a sequel to Making Gay History?" Like I wrote the second edition, which was supposed to take 6 months. It took me a year and a half for the second edition. I will never write another book on gay history. It can eat you alive. And you can also starve to death.
Because you end it with Stonewall?
No. The original edition was 1945 to 1990. Second edition was 1950 to 2000.
Okay, so I just proved how much of your book I actually read, which was
It's okay.
Which was right up until Stonewall.
It's very dense. I actually prefer the first edition, where each person has their own chapter.
Interesting. Because you kind of switch between them, and then I didn't realize that.
When I did the first edition, my goal was to use the timeline as the narrative thread and intercut the stories. But I wasn't a skilled enough writer at the time to do that. I also ran out of time. So with the second edition, I completely dismantled the book. So first book, each person is a chapter, which lets you really get to know each person. When you do what I did for the second edition, I deconstructed the book and then intercut the stories. It's a little hard to follow all the people. It's easy to lose track of who's who. But then you have the advantage of using the timeline as the narrative thread is you have the chronology driving you through the book. I don't think either one is perfect, but I prefer, don't tell anyone, I prefer the first edition, which I persuaded my publisher to reprint in an ebook. So the first edition is called Making History.
Right.
You might ask why it's not called Making Gay History?
I'm sure the publisher.
Well, there was nervousness about having the word gay in the title in 1992.
Yeah.
They were fearful that the sales force wouldn't be able to sell it, or they wouldn't be comfortable, and that bookstores wouldn't be comfortable showing it face out. But 10 years later, when we did the second edition in 2002, the world had changed, and we just called it Making Gay History. I find the second edition hard to read. I say that about my own book. I much prefer the podcast.
All right. Well, I'm gonna take a moment to plug not just your podcast, which is phenomenal, but also the book, because for anyone who hasn't read it, it is written just as I would have written it if I didn't have the confines of academia telling me that I needed to put things in my own words, because what I think is so amazing about both your podcasts and the book is that you allow the people who are making history, as you call it, to speak for themselves. And I try to do that as much as I possibly could. And some of my, my defense committee, when I was defending my dissertation, got very annoyed of how much I was relying on, Frank and these characters to speak for themselves.
It's what made your book so rich. But I know academia is different. If you hadn't done that, it would have made it's not as interesting. Exactly. I loved hearing Frank's voice. I loved reading what he wrote.
And you take it to the full extent of allowing this full cast of characters to speak for themselves, which I don't think academia has afforded them that privilege of speaking for themselves, which I think is a necessity. So anyone who hasn't read it, go read these characters and these voices for yourselves, because at the end of the day, historians can tell you what to think and how to understand history, but the activists are the ones who are really making change. Whether it's like Shirley Willer versus Frank Kameny, and they're both talking on the same page, it's just, it cannot get better. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, it was a rare privilege. I had no idea. No, I had an idea at the time how special the opportunity was to sit down with these people who were, the dinosaurs were still walking the earth. Mm-hmm. That's how I thought of it. Mm-hmm. I was shocked to discover that most of the people who started the movement were still alive.
Yeah.
And to me, it was ancient history. I didn't know that the movement started before Stonewall until I started my work.
Yeah.
And so I could pick up the phone. There was no internet. So I could write to somebody or pick up the phone and then be on the phone with Lisa Ben, whose real name was Edith Ide, who wrote the first newsletter for lesbians on our office typewriter at RKO Radio Pictures in 1947.
Wow.
And there she was on the phone. And then I was sitting with her on our front porch. And now all of these people are gone. Almost none of the people I interviewed are alive. So I have this odd connection to this world that is gone. But I knew them. I got to meet them.
I'm so envious.
I would be envious too. But what I envy is that you're at the beginning of your career, and I am at the other end of it. And I can't wait to see what you're going to do next.
Oh gosh.
What are you going to do next?
Well, I'm in Los Angeles, so I came here very much with making the segue from academia to entertainment, and continuing to tell stories that reach not just academics and students of history, but the general public. And I tell everyone, one of my first events last week was with Justin Lance Black, who wrote the Oscar-winning screenplay for Milk, about Harvey Milk, and that film is what proved to me that I had so much to learn about queer history, of how much of it had been erased. And that was a product of Hollywood, and that is what created a gay historian. So I want to kind of emulate Lance's own progress, and maybe take it more even outside of film, and do more of exactly what we're doing now. What you yourself are an inspiration when it comes to podcasts and some of these new forms of media, of getting these stories out there and proving that not only are they important, but they're actually entertaining.
Yeah. I hear a Frank Kameny screenplay in the works.
Ooh.
Not me.
But stay tuned.
Yes.
Absolutely. It looks like we have a lot of questions, so I'm wondering
we do.
Maybe we should bring back Vivian. Okay. Let's see if I can. Hello.
I'm following the light as the sun goes down.
Oh. Can you hear us, Vivian? Uh-oh, we can't hear you. Uh-oh. I'm going to close your video and invite you back. But until then, let's see if I can find... So this first one is a little bit of a controversy. that I've actually been meaning to ask you yourself, but privately. So I guess we'll do it out in, in the air. It says, in Eric Marcus's Making Gay History podcast, Marsha Johnson says, the way I winded up being at Stonewall that night, I was having a party uptown. And we were all out there in Miss Sylvia Rivera, and then we're over in the park having a cocktail. I was uptown, and I didn't get downtown until about 2 o'clock because I already got downtown and the place was already on fire. And it was a raid already. The riots already started. Is this true? Or did Marsha and Sylvia throw the first brick? I defer that to you.
The beauty of having recordings of people is that they get to tell the story the way they remember it. So David Carter wrote the definitive book. David just died recently, sadly, young for me. He wrote the definitive book on Stonewall. And from what he came to understand, based on all of his research and also recordings, Marsha indeed was not there until at least 2 a.m, or perhaps a little earlier. And Sylvia was likely not there the first night and was there on subsequent nights. What I like to focus on is the work that they did after Stonewall, and less so on exactly what happened to Stonewall. That's a much less interesting story than what came before and after the movement. Are you still there? You are. You're back.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So, Marsha, I don't have to answer for Marsha. Marsha says on the tape that was the case, and I often joke that that my mother was in the village that night and she spent a lot of time in the village. That she threw the first brick. No one knows exactly what happened at Stonewall, but Marsha was clear about where she was, and Sylvia was most likely at Bryant Park that night.
I'm going to give a hot take.
Question?
Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll never forget when I actually, one of the few people in my book who I got to spend a significant amount of time with was Randy Wicker, and he made me swear when he pointed to it. I don't think it was your interview, it was another interview where Marsha admitted to coming a bit later. He made me swear that I wouldn't quote him on it or like reference it because he understood the importance of the mythology, not the history, but the mythology of it. And, you know, I don't think it necessarily is our place to be combating and getting in arguments over these very minute details, because I think it diminishes the role of people like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, not just at Stonewall, but in the months after Stonewall, when Sylvia Rivera was extremely active. And that's one of the findings in my book that I've been shouting from the rooftops, because it's actually probably one of my proudest findings, is how she was single-handedly responsible for rejuvenating the Legal Action Committee of the Gay Activists Alliance, which then became Lambda Legal. So we can all thank Sylvia Rivera for marriage equality. I mean, it's there. We have the receipts in the archive. And so when you get into these really small questions of who threw what and when, I think it diminishes their role. Second, I also think we have to recognize that when you spoke with Marsha and or Sylvia later in her life, there's an equally good, if not better, probability that they were wrong then versus in the past, that they're remembering, or Marsha saying, oh no, we were doing this at this time.
I always say about oral history is that history is how we remember it, how we would like to remember it, and how we would like to be remembered in it. And if we interviewed 50 people who were at Stonewall that night, each of them was standing in a different place, experiencing it in a different way and remembering it in a different way. It was a collective action. And I think we need to give credit to I call them street kids, because that's how Sylvia and Marsha referred to them, the street kids, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, who led the initial charge. But then lots of other people joined in. And I love the broader story, and it's a big enough story to be inclusive. But I love the idea of focusing on the individuals around Stonewall, because it's such contested territory. And that's why I let Marsha speak for herself and Sylvia speak for herself. I'm the conduit.
Right.
And if you want to hear them speak, we did 2 episodes with Sylvia, 1 episode with Marcia and Randy, and we also found a 1970 recording, an interview with Marcia and Sylvia that was conducted by I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name at the moment, Liz Cowan. And that we did a bonus episode, a special episode with that recording. There are so many interesting people to listen to who live through this movement. So is there a second question?
Yeah. Vivian, we can't hear you, and it's not letting me toggle. It really doesn't. Crowdcast really dislikes Vivian. I'll just go ahead and read the next one. Let's see. Christian asks, can you tell us more about the use of, quote, sexual deviants in official documents referring to homosexuals? Why do you choose the particular word as a title of the book? Which is a great question because...
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is. And I was perplexed and amused by when I started promoting the book in the title. A lot of people who would see it on Facebook or whatever their very first reaction would be that I was a conservative, anti-gay, crazy writer who was using this term, when the reality was, quite the opposite. But for why I chose the title itself, 50% of it is to be tongue-in-cheek, because the book the cover is modeled after the government document that was, I think the word they used was perverts in the federal government, and a big part of the book is told from the perspective of people like J. Edgar Hoover, people like running the security office in the Pentagon. And I think it's important to understand that perspective as well, because it also shows how persecution actually functions. And on the flip side, the word deviant actually wasn't used as often by the government. The FBI had, for example, its sex deviant without the N. The word deviant was more commonly used by psychiatrists and sexologists, because at the time it was a very neutral, almost statistical word to talk about any sort of social group who deviated from the norm, especially societal norms. So you see people like Benjamin Cartman, who has one of his own introductions in one of the earlier chapters, use that word, or people like Laud Humphreys use the word in a very non-stigmatizing way, because they're simply talking about people who deviate from the straight norm. The other reason I chose it... Oh, well, I was just going to say is, like the word queer, right? Like the word queer, it captures not just gay men like Frank Kameny, it also captures the full spectrum of people on the LGBTQ plus, et cetera, umbrella.
It's also a great title. It's when you're publishing a book. Was that?
Yes, that too.
Yeah, and that. When you're publishing a book, it's really important to have a title that catches people's attention. And using a provocative word like that does catch people's attention. And also journalists at the time in the 50s and 60s used that word all the time, or headlines in the tabloids, deviants arrested. So yeah, I think it's better than pervert, but it's actually a great title.
Thank you.
No, yes, there you are.
Oh my gosh, I'm here. I was talking the whole time. I don't know what's going on with Crowdcast. Sorry, guys. But I loved the questions y'all got to answer so far. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to dump them in the ask a question button right at the bottom. This question is for both of you. Eric Cerveny, would you like to continue your scholarship digging deep into a singular person's story, issue, or event? Or are you more interested in Eric Marcus's journalistic and oral historian methods, where he is building a broad record based on many, many lived experiences?
Ooh. My answer is both. And if you read the book, I try to do both, because yes, Frank is on the spine of the book, but every single chapter opens with a different character. and a look at their lives. And they're all characters who influenced Frank or were influenced by him, either directly or indirectly. And so, you know, as a historian, for example, my PhD dissertation, I didn't get to do that. I didn't get to have these deep dives into all these other characters. And so, yes, there was this, but I always knew, even writing my dissertation, that I wanted to do that. And so I think the core of the book is still about Frank and the Mattachine Society, but really the story of the book is a story of America and of the 1960s and of the larger interconnected struggle between the Black Freedom Movement, women's liberation, trans resistance, and Frank Kameny. And it was people like Eric Marcus who proved to me that that was possible.
Well, and you, in your book, you document how Frank drew a direct line from the Black Civil Rights Movement to the Gay Rights Movement. And I wonder how much Ernestine Eckstein influenced him, if at all, because she talked about the need in a 1965 interview that we did an episode about in the Making Gay History podcast. She was interviewed by Barbara Giddings and Kayla Huson and talks about the need to bring cases into court. And I don't know if she and Frank, she was in Washington, but I don't know if she and Frank, how much interaction they had. But you do that brilliantly. You bring in lots of different voices, and I think of it as the luxury of focusing on and taking a deep dive into one person's story. But it's also the reality of doing this work, unless you're doing it in an academic context or you have a very large book contract. It's hard to spend the kind of time that you did digging through a singular subject. I mean, my book was done, I did it in 2.5 years. I had an advance that wasn't enough to cover my living expenses. I had advertising copy at the same time. It's very challenging doing a book where you take a deep dive into one person's life. And like Caro, as he did with The Power Broker, you map out this period of history in such a rich way that it's a story of America, using Frank as the thread and using this one person's story to gain entry. It really is very much like Caro. He did an interview with Terry Gross, I think it was, and he talked about how his books were not about one person. He used one person as a vehicle to illuminate a period of history, which you do brilliantly.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, you couldn't have said anything kinder, because I studied Caro and I studied Taylor Branch, and within the Academy, Heather Ann Thompson, if anyone hasn't read her book, Blood in the Water, about the Attica prison revolt, she kind of also proved to me that my theory that you can tell serious history in an extremely thrilling and human way, that was really reassuring, and also just an amazing study, because it's not just about a single prison revolt, it's about prisons in America and how and the history of it. So I'd encourage anyone, whether you're a journalist or historian, to fuse those two traditions.
For both Erics, besides Frank Kameny, what is one of your favorite episodes of Making Gay History to revisit?
Ooh.
Oh, I have so many, but one of my standout favorites is a man named Wendell Sayers, who was sent to the Mayo Clinic in 1920 when he was 16 years old, and was diagnosed as a homosexual, and later found his way to the Mattachine Society in Denver, attended the 1959 convention, and it talks about the intersection or the issues involved in sexuality and race. He thought he found his people, and he really wasn't welcome. I interviewed him when he was in his 80s. An astonishing man, had a remarkable life, and in some ways a very sad life because of racism that he experienced in the larger world and also in the Mattachine Society, but built this life, a very successful life. He was the first African-American attorney to work for the state attorney general in Colorado in the 1960s. And he could have sacrificed his whole career just by being found out as having been a homosexual who attended one of these meetings. So he's one. Also Edith Ide, who wrote that first newsletter for lesbians in 1947, also sang her own songs in gay clubs in LA in the 1950s and 60s. But it's like it's like I interviewed 100 people, and there are only a handful I didn't like. I loved so many of them. But in the podcast, in the book, the original book, I was very much the journalist. I didn't say how I felt about people. When I do the podcast, I share a little bit more about my feelings about people.
I have to say, you were so gracious to share with me, and I posted on my social media, because everyone, like I said, the fact that Eric was able to sit down with these figures is it. I as a historian, I can dream of nothing more. So just how grateful I am as a historian for you sharing the audio and the transcripts with the world is such an inspiration and just an amazing resource for anyone who hasn't delved into them yet. But I don't think it was you yourself who interviewed him. You interviewed Walter, right? Bayard Rustin's partner.
Yes.
And then, but
yes.
also,
so I'll tell you the story behind that.
Right. Yeah. But included
so
Rustin's interview as well.
We were on the hunt for a Bayard Rustin interview. I've often been asked, who do you wish you had interviewed, who you didn't get to interview? And Bayard Rustin was one of those people. For those who don't know who Bayard Rustin was, he was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He organized the first freedom ride through the American South in 1947. And he was the principal architect of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And he was openly gay and paid a high price for that. So he died in 1987. I didn't start my work until 88. And we were hoping to find an interview with Bayard Rustin. Long story short, my executive producer, founding editor of Making Gay History, Sarah Birmingham, knew one of the mothers of kids who go to the same school that her daughters go to in New York City. And that woman grew up in the same building as Bayard Rustin and was in and out of his apartment and knew Walter Nagel, Bayard Rustin's surviving partner. So Sarah was introduced to Walter Nagel, asked him if he knew where we could find this particular speech that he gave. Long story short, he had a box of cassette tapes under his bed. This for the 10 years he was with Bayard. He recorded every interview and every speech that Bayard gave. Wow. We couldn't use the audio from the speech we were looking for, where he talked about his sexuality, because it wasn't good enough. But he gave an interview to Peg Byron, a young freelance journalist who was writing for the Washington Blade, and the tape recorder was right in the middle of the table. And so there was that 1987 interview with Bayard Rustin, where he talks about his sexuality and its impact on his role in the Black Civil Rights Movement. No one had ever heard it before. And if not for the fact that Sarah's daughters go to PS 11, we would never have found this tape. There were handoffs of cassette tapes on the corner of 23rd Street and 8th Avenue in New York City between Walter and Sarah as she was working through his pile of tapes to see if she could find what we needed. And I joke that we deal in cassette tapes in New York City on street corners. So that's the Bayard Rustin, and it's an extraordinary interview. I had heard many of the things that Bayard said. I'd read many of the things that I heard Bayard say in this interview, but to hear him say it in his own voice, it's remarkable. And we just reposted that episode just this past Sunday. We posted the episode with Bayard.
That's so cool and really timely for this moment that we're in.
Yes.
There's a lot of. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, a lot of questions. Go ahead. I know we're running out of time. No. Go ahead.
There's a lot of questions on here about what your next book or next project is, Eric Cerveny. But I feel like maybe you said no more books and project.
No, I didn't say no more books. I didn't say that.
Project forthcoming.
I
but
said that.
Maybe sort of a similar question. Like, who do you feel like, similar to how you, Eric, discovered that Kamini really needed a book? Who's the next person that like needs a book that someone should go write about, whether or not it's you?
Barbara Giddings and Kayla Huson.
Oh my gosh, yes. I just sent, Eric, you'll appreciate this. I just sent, I was just on the phone with Kayla Huson, who was Frank's very good friend and the de facto photographer of the entire homophile movement and just an incredible activist in person, is an
very much alive.
Very much alive in an assisted living facility. And I tell anyone who doesn't think that Corona is a threat to us or our culture, I say so much of our history is in, whether it's nursing homes or assisted living facilities. So the very last remnants of who we are as a queer community are there now and need to be protected. And one of them is Kayla Huson. And I was just on the phone with her assisted living facility to get her. She can't. The text is a little bit too small to actually read the book, and she has also she and Barbara, her lover, have their own chapters in the book, and the text is a little bit too small for her to read. So I sent over the audio file for for the audio book for her to actually listen to. So I'm excited to hear what she thinks. But as a photographer, she didn't like my headshot that's on the book. She said I look too serious, which isn't serious, but she gave some friendly advice.
For your next book, Eric.
What's that?
For your next book.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Look happier.
I need to look happier.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. A history buff question here, and apologies in advance if I say this wrong. What intersection and common goals were set by the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of, is it Bilitis?
Bilitis. Yeah.
Bilitis, and did they confer?
Say it one more time. What were
Did they confer at all? Were there any intersections or common goals between those two organizations?
Oh yeah, Eric, I'll let you.
There were. It was. I'm just thinking of something Barbara once said to me, Barbara Giddings, about being critical of the men's bathroom habits, because the men were always getting arrested in bathrooms having sex, and it complicated things for the women. So misogyny was very much alive and well. I mean, it is today, but you can imagine in the 1950s. Any number of the women I interviewed said that at Mattachine they were expected to serve the cookies, and they didn't like that with good reason. So yes, they worked together. But when the Daughters of Bilitis was founded in 1955 in San Francisco, they didn't know that Mattachine's headquarters was in San Francisco as well, and had been founded in 1950. It was a teeny tiny movement. It's hard for us to imagine now what a small movement it was and how few activists there were. And Frank, when I interviewed him, said there weren't even 5 activists in the whole world in 1965. I love Frank's voice. So if you haven't heard Frank speak, he's just got this.
That makes one of us.
Incredibly, yes, it's just this incredibly electric voice. There were also tensions, as one would expect between those two groups. And there have always been tensions between LGBTQ people forever. That's nothing new. But yes, they absolutely work together, and often because Daughters of Bilitis was a smaller organization and not quite as well funded, they were all poorly funded. They often piggybacked with the Mattachine Society to hold events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I would suggest for anyone who wants to learn more about, this answers the other question as well, I think a lot of the figures within the Daughters of Bilitis deserve their own studies, and thick studies. And for anyone, you don't have to be a historian. If you read it in my book and you see a quote from a lesbian activist, whether it's Del Martin, Phyllis Lyon, Barbara Giddings, if you go into the back of the book to the endnotes, there's a citation, and a lot of those citations and a lot of those quotes come from the Ladder, which is the publication of the Daughters of Bilitis. And it was someone at Berkeley did the incredible job of digitizing the vast majority of the Ladder issues. So if you see just a quote, I only was able to quote very small portions of it. But for example, Del Martin's 1959 speech, where she's calling out the men of the Mattachine and saying, you only care about, the ability to have sex in bathrooms, whereas us women have 2 different struggles that we have to be fighting. You can go, I reference it in the book, find the exact date of the Ladder issue, and then you can go to the deviantsarchive.org. All of the Ladder editions there's a whole collection from the Lesbian Her Story archives. You can go read the full speeches, the full articles, see Barbara Giddings, see what effect she and Kay had on the latter after she became the editor, and watch it for yourself. You don't have to be a historian in order to deal with archives and how to read these words that were created just by everyday humans and heroes.
That's awesome. It looks like we are out of time. So just want to make one final plug. I know this has been so awesome. I feel like I've learned so much. One final plug, the bookstore sponsor for this event is the Women and Children First bookstore. So we are trying to support independent bookstores on this book tour. You can click the green Purchase the Deviants War button right at the bottom to order from Women and Children First. Otherwise, thank you both so much for being here. Thank you, Eric Marcus, for joining us on Eric Cerveny's tour.
And everyone go check
and the
out
book
Eric's.
is
Thank you. And
the
likewise,
podcast, yes, making gay history come. Yeah.
Making Gay History, the podcast is phenomenal because a lot of the voices we talk about, you have to hear it for yourself. You have to hear their voices. We can describe Frank's voice as much as we want, but you have to hear it. You have to hear how he talks, and you allow us to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a delight to be a part of your tour.